So, Mr. Cunningham, where do you hail from?
Where do I live, or
Where do you come from?
where do I come from? I come from Lesser Slave Lake area, which as it was known in the early days. I'm a direct descendant of Mushtush, who was a signatory to Treaty 8, also a direct descendant to his sister, Betsy Catherine Willier, who married Samuel Cunningham. That's my genealogy as it goes down. My dad's father was Albert Cunningham, the son of Sam Cunningham and Betsy Catherine Willier. He married Betsy Coutre. Betsy Coutre is the daughter of Louis Coutre and Sophie Coutre. Louis Coutre was ticket number 2 on the Michel band. Because the Michel band was hereditary, his father Joe was the chief, Joe Coutre. Michel Coutre would have been the next chief in line for the Michel band. That band was then franchised, and then he moved over here prior to the signing of Treaty 8 in 1899. But he moved here in about 1890, I believe it was, along with his wife and their children, Betsy Coutre being one of them. And that would have been my dad's mother and my grandfather.
Right.
Now, on the Willier side, Mushtush had one son. His name was Alexander Mushtush. And my grandmother, Melanie Mushtush, she married Alphonse Gladue. I'll get into Alphonse Gladue's history shortly. However, Melanie would have been my grandmother, and she married Alphonse Gladue, like I said. And from there was my mother and my uncles and my aunties. So Melanie would have been my grandmother. Alphonse Gladue, on the other hand, his father was Namur Willier. Namur Gladue. Namur Gladue married Isabella Andrews, and she come from the north shore of Lesser Slave Lake. Her father was, according to the records, was ticket number 1 for the Gruard band. Isabella Andrews, lived around Andrews Point, and then my grandfather married her. My grandfather my great grandfather, Namur Willier, his father was Baptiste Gladue. Baptiste Gladue, and he died in 1888 in Lesser Slave Lake. His wife was Marie Gaucher. She was born in 1849 at Fort Jasper. And from there, she moved over to Lesser Slave Lake to Gruard with her husband, John Baptiste Gladue. Their father was John Baptiste Gladue's father was Louis San Gladue, ticket number 2 on the Papachis band. So they were all directly interrelated, and that is how I came about.
And when we talk about the signing of Treaty 8, you have the very first signing was here.
Yes.
And it was at Willow Point.
Willow Point.
Correct. And it was signed by 3 of the regional members.
Yep.
Pinochet was chosen to be the chief of all of the bands to represent them. And then each band subsequently nominated someone else to become the headman or spokesman for their band. So from what I understand, Mustus was for Sucker Creek, and Felix Giroux was for Swan River, and then Pinochet was for drift pile,
True.
correct?
Correct.
So knowing that those dynamics of those three brothers, two being full blood brothers, one being an adopted brother,
Hmm.
which is Felix Giroux, correct?
Yep.
Um, those then direct descendants of them are all related to Chief Papa's Chase,
Yes.
and they are all related to Chief Poundmaker, if I remember correctly.
Yes.
A good portion of them
Yeah.
are. And then Pinochet would have been considered the first Grand Chief of Treaty 8, correct?
That would have been, yeah, I guess you can call it that. See,
Because there
how?
was no chief, there was
No,
no chief and council structure back then,
no, there wasn't. And there was no selection by the people.
only for the treaty signing. No?
No, it wasn't.
Oh,
See, generally speaking, at the very start, it's always been like that. There was no, uh, like, the chief was a name that was given to Kinosio. And the Caucasians that came over, Europeans that came over, in their infinite wisdom, they have to have structure. They always have to have structure. So in their structure, see, according to the stories, I'll back up a little bit. According to the stories that they had, and this I was told, and this is something that we know quite well. When this was prior to uh, 1899, this was prior to June. I think it would have been early June when the commission came over, and they came over, and there was 4 RCMP with them. Redcoats is what they call them.
yeah.
Okay. When they landed at Willow Point, they come in through the mouth, and they come from Lesser Slave Lake along the river, and they landed at Willow Point. The people were gathered there along the lake at that time, and then when they saw them, they were frightened. They were scared, and they didn't want to go and meet with them. And the reason that they were scared was because of the wars and the history of not only Poundmaker, there was also not only Papa's Cheese, but Big Bear, all of these, and the Louis Riel rebellion, all that was still fresh in their mind. It was only like, say, 15, 20 years prior to that. And they also gotten their land taken away from them on the Papastis Reserve and also on the Michelle Reserve. So so that while they were settling here, and when the Redcoats and the Commission came over, they were quite fearful. Mushters said, "Well, somebody's got to do something." This is what I was told by my grandmother, and they said somebody's got to do something. So he went ahead. Never asked anybody. He just went ahead. That was his nature. If something was happening, he walked forward, and then he went ahead and went and met with them. And he was the oldest brother, so I guess he felt it was up to him to do that. So he went ahead. And then he met with the commission, started talking to them, and then his brother Kinosio came over. Kinosio was more fluent in English and also French than the rest. So he started speaking. So he became kind of a spokesperson at that time, only not because he was selected by anybody, but because he had the ability to speak. So then, when they entered into the treaty, the commission elevated him to status of chief. He became the chief because they needed somebody to sign as a chief, because all the other treaties were designed like that. So Kinosio signed as the main chief. And back then, it really didn't matter who signed, because ultimately the main leader was Mushters anyway. He was their main leader, and so they all signed, and they got the others to sign with them. I mean, because that's the treaty that he entered into. One of the key, there was actually 3 areas of that within that treaty. 3 areas that were very, very, uh, where Mushters was adamant that they would be included in the treaty. And the first one was that, I'll say it in Cree, and I'll translate it. And what he stated, kahkeo ne wahumaganak, ndutima kahkeo umaya tepanna skekuta kahkeo agamawa. Anohtuma ego utinigan. Ikse yago kanta vihtaman. The other thing was we're not going to pay any taxes. The taxes were free of taxes. And we want land in severalty. We want to be able to not only live on the reserve, but we want to be able to live off reserve as well and have our own land in severalty. The commission at that time didn't want to agree with that. And he said, if none of those are going to be included, then I'm not signing the treaty. And his other brothers agreed. So they relented on severalty and the taxes. They included that they said, okay. But they didn't mention anything about families. But it was, and they automatically thought it's a given. Yep, we agree, so they signed a treaty. Now, Wahumaganak, Wahutuin is what they try to say now. And they're trying to say that Wahutuin means an affinity with the plants and animals and everything else. But that's, yes, it is, but to a lesser degree. To a greater degree, it means family. It means my brothers, my sisters, my nephews, my nieces. Anybody that we adopt is my family. And that's where we gained our strength. And that's where we've always had our strength, is this Wahutuin. And it was important enough for the chief to say that this will always be. They will always be treaty. So, taking that into it, his brother-in-law, his wife's brothers would always be entered into treaty. And that included Samuel Cunningham, because he married his sister. That would include Albert Cunningham, and there are a few others, but Albert Cunningham, because that was his nephew. Betsy Coutre would have been entered into treaty as well, because that was his niece. The funny thing is that Betsy Coutre, Mushtosh's mother, I think it was Marie Coutre, that would have been her aunt. So they were all interrelated. Every one of them were all interrelated, including Albert Cunningham. Samuel Cunningham, he wasn't related to them. However, Betsy Coutre was. Albert Cunningham was. We were all interrelated. So there was no need at that time for Albert to enter into a treaty. There was no need for Sam Cunningham to enter into a treaty. They didn't need to because it was a given. That's how we were. That's how it was all along.
So then, when I look at the documentation that I've been able to source and find, I learned that prior to Treaty 8, all of the First Nations people here considered themselves one family, one band, one.
Yes.
Right? And after 1936, the Indian Act changed,
right,
and the government actually changed things so that each brother was basically chief of his own band. So you had Kinuseo had his band at Drift Pile, and Justus here in Sucker Creek, and then Felix Giroux was his family was given in Forest Swan River.
Yeah.
And then you had there were two other signers.
Nisotasis.
Yes, and he would have been for
Sawridge.
And then the other gentleman was for Gruard, Capino.
Yes. Yep.
Right? And then.
And one for Sturgeon.
Yes, but he was only a witness. According to the treaty document, he signed as a witness.
Okay.
And his name was Captain.
Yep.
Now, how would
Captain was a brother. They called him Captain, but he was a brother to Musters.
He was one of Mustus's brothers.
Yes.
So which brother would he have been?
That I am not 100% sure. But there are 7 full brothers. Okay. And in Cree, the old Mushtush, Kinosio, Ogumau, Astastahun, Anskiup Mutio, Westago, there was one I'm missing. Uh, I'm missing the one. I'm not sure who it was. And then, of course, there was Felix Giroux,
Yes.
but it was an adopted brother.
Now,
But
there was also a Felix that was, and his name started with an A, his Cree name.
Astastahun.
He was also known as Felix.
Yeah, Felix Astastahun.
Yeah, so there were the 2 Felixes.
Yeah.
Giroux, though,
And,
was the adopted
yeah.
brother who became chief of Swan River.
Yep.
Or his family.
And Astastahun became chief of Driftpile after the passing, excuse me, after the passing of Kinosio.
Okay, so I have got my history.
Yeah. And John, after the passing of Mushtush, John Kaginusit became chief for a time being.
Interesting. So then when we look at the lineage of the signers of Treaty 8 and the chiefs of the region, it's basically all of the direct descendants of Gladue and what was her name?
Willier?
Yes.
Namur Willier and Lizette Gladue? Absolutely. Absolutely. Because Masingunum, Baptiste Willier, was their son. And these were his children that signed into treaty.
That's right.
The thing with Baptiste Willier, he had Marie Coutre was his wife. Marie Coutre was the sister to Louis Coutre. So she would have, her lineage also would have been, not that she would have been chief at any point in time, but her father was the chief of the Michel band.
Okay. And her father
was Joe Coutre.
Okay.
Joe Coutre Jr. Because Joe Coutre Sr. was how it worked out too. There was this, they called him Alex. Alex was, and then for some other reason, they gave him a name of Alex Coutre. And then his son, Joe, his first son, Joe, the oldest, became the chief, was Alex Coutre, and then Joe Coutre, and then Joe Jr., and the next one would have been Louis
Right. Okay.
Coutre.
Now, on the Papa's Chase side
Yeah.
of things, after Papa's Chase was enfranchised and lost Fort Edmonton
Yep.
and that whole thing,
Yep.
how does that then affect the other signatories as far as the lineage goes? So, who all would be related to Papa's Chase?
Actually, all of us.
All of you.
All of us. We're all related to Papa Chase through Papa Chase's mom.
Right.
See, because his mother was Lizette Gladue Quinn.
Yeah.
And then she married Namur Willier. So that is how we're directly related.
Yeah, because Chief Papa's Chase was her
Son.
child, her
Yeah.
son with her first husband.
Yeah, John Quinn.
John Quinn. Okay. So that gives you guys all of that direct blood descendants.
Yes.
From the Papa's Chase First Nation. Now.
And the Michel band as well.
Michel band, right.
But Michel band second because Baptiste Willier's wife.
Right. And so a lot of the lineage seems to come from the female side of the family.
Yes.
And that is pretty much traditional within the Cree community, is it not?
Yes, it is with the, see, we are Algonquin Cree.
Right.
Okay. A lot of people didn't realize that, but I did a lot of research, which I found kind of funny. My son was doing his law school, and our cousin has asked him to, like, if he knew the history of the Cunninghams and the Williers and so on. His grandmother, so, and this was Louis Cardinal. You heard of him. Anyway, he was asking my son that, so my son sent him over to this guy in Plamondon. And he said, this guy knows his history about Cunningham. He's got a whole lineage of Cunningham and the whole area. So then, then that guy turned around and told Lewis, well, he said, I know a lot, he said, about Cunningham's and our history. He said, but if you want to know, so phone Wayne Cunningham. So it went about from my son over here, like that, come back to me.
Right back to
Yeah. So then I said, and this was because of a lawsuit that was going on with in the state of New York, where Lewis's half brother was suing the town because of he got an accident injury or something like that at work, and he was working for the state, but according to some of their policies, if you work for the state, you can't sue the state.
Right.
So anyway, and if you're a citizen, or if you're not a citizen, you can't sue. So something like that. So we had to prove. It was kind of a reverse because we had to prove that his brother was actually less had. They want to know the Indian blood content, so we had to prove he had more non-Aboriginal blood than he did Aboriginal blood.
Right.
So we did. I proved it for them, and then I sent all that information to his lawyer. They won their case, by the way, so it was okay. I didn't mind.
When we look at 1936,
Mm-hmm.
when the Department of Indian Affairs changed the structure
Mm-hmm.
and took the First Nation community up here and divided it into 5 nations. So
Mm-hmm.
you had Sawridge, you had Capuino, Driftpile, Sucker Creek, and Swan River that
Right.
all became independent nations.
Yeah.
How did that affect the community?
Well, initially it didn't really. Excuse me. Initially, it really didn't have an impact, and but it became more as initially it was okay. Well, okay, we're not there all the time, so you can look after Driftball, you can look after so on and so, like Sucker Creek and so on. You know, it's okay. You can have the administration, but the biggest reason was that the administration itself, the administration of the bands, they wanted to include like each band would have their own administration. And that's where the impact came because that's when the per capita distributions and so on, size of your band determined the amount of money that you got. So it became almost pitting one against the other. So Sawridge, which was excuse me, wasn't a very large band, so their administrative dollars were quite a bit less. Swan River, same thing. Driftpile and Sucker Creek were quite a bit more. Gruard was less. So what they wanted to do then, and this is the federal government, and it wasn't not so much the federal government because the federal government implemented it, but it was the provincial government that pushed for it. The provincial government entered into the Transfer Agreement Act with the province in 1931. And the reason they did, with the war measures, with the war, the Hungry 30s, and so on, so they needed to raise more money, like I had mentioned earlier. They need to raise more money. So what they did is they started implementing taxes on the people, and it wasn't. And even though some of the people, like they had taken land in severalty, and there was no taxes or anything like that, and they believed this is what they believed in, but that's not what happened. They ended up getting placed on the list for Métis. Not because they were they were mixed blood, yes, but they were Indians, plain and simple. That's how they considered themselves. Nihiawak. This is what we always were. That's what we said. Why we've done that? And you mentioned earlier, like it's usually the like they follow the women's family. Nobody's ever thought of it, or maybe they have, but just haven't heard. But the reason for following the women's family is very, very significant, and that alone is to sustain who we are as a people, to sustain our culture. Why we do that, and why it should have been like that, is that when if a man and woman, they had two daughters, okay? So, in our culture and tradition, if we followed it, they got married, their husbands moved in with them within that family circle. So now, and so did the other one. So now, instead of only having two and four, now you've got six. You've got a larger family. And that gave the strength to the family and maintained that strength. If you ended up, a man and a woman, had two daughters, and if they followed the European custom where they went with the husband, after the two daughters married, you got two people that don't have any children, and how long can they sustain their lives? Back then, they couldn't. Eventually, they'd be destitute. They'd be a drain on the rest of society. And if they followed European culture, then eventually they would be banished because they're not a contributing member to that society. That is the reason for it. That's why they followed, and that's why John Quinn became John Quinn Gladue. Yes. And and in doing it that way, you maintain the family structure. You maintain the family connectivitis, if whatever you want to call it. It connects your family, and it shows like your cousins. It tells you who your cousins are, how you speak the language, tells you who your ndutima, nwahumagana, all of those words that have a significant meaning, like your mother-in-law, Njakos, is my sister-in-law. Like all these words in Cree tell you on what side, whether it's your brother's wife or your sister's husband. Those are how the words connect. And if you understand, like even if you don't understand it, but if you're open to it and you could say it in Cree, well, yeah, that's my brother's wife. Njakos, Nsugos. All these words. Like so having that and having said that, it's something that give us strength. That's that wahuhtuin, kahkiawi ne wahumaganak. That's all my relations. Ndutimak, that's another extended relations. So when you say those words, ne wahumaganak, you know, iwahuhtoya, kahkiaw, that means we are all related. And each and every one of us around here. That was the single most that was the most significant thing that the residential schools and Indian Affairs took away from us.
Right. Is the family structure.
Is the family structure. They more than that, they took away this wahutuin.
The family connectedness.
Yes, the connectiveness, because even here, like I'll bring it up briefly, but I don't want to talk about it because right now I'm currently in some litigation with the band because of the residency clause they have in their custom election regulations. I don't agree with it because I believe that we are all entitled for representation, and that we that live off reserve, that live around the surrounding areas, yeah, so long as we are band members, each and every one of us should have an opportunity to run for chief or council. That is under this new structure. That's the way it should be. And yes, we want that. Now, to take that away, you see, initially, Indian Affairs said, well, what we're going to do is the chief, because they included it, before you're going to choose a chief. The chief does not have to live on the reserve. He doesn't have to live on a reserve. You can select a chief from anywhere. Could be anybody. Secondly, all the councillors have to live on a reserve. So when they changed that in 1936, they brought that up and they said, okay, the chief can run. But the reason that they did that was because the very first chief of Sucker Creek did not live here.
Right.
East Prairie. He lived in East Prairie. He's the first chief. of Sucker Creek. Actually, he was the main chief of all of the whole area, but it was broke down to Sucker Creek. Anyway, he was the first chief. He lived in East Prairie, and it's not hereditary because one of the funny things about this is that just to show you or just to provide proof of how this Wahootuan meant and what it meant to him and what it meant to the people of the time. In from on the Treaty Payless from 1905 from 9 up until 1907, John Kaginusit was not a treaty Indian. It states in the Payless, non-treaty Indian. However, he was brought into the treaty by Mushtush. Mushtush brought him in the treaty. He became a member of the Sucker Creek. And after, when Mushtush passed away in 1918, John Kaginusit became a chief.
Right. And Mustas passed away, him and his wife, because of the Spanish flu. Correct?
Exactly. In East Prairie.
And then, what,
18.
Yeah, and then they moved his
67.
remains during the centennial.
Yep.
To Sucker Creek.
Yep.
Why do you think they moved his remains? What was the impetus behind that?
I don't know, but I think it's a repatriation because East Prairie was a Métis settlement.
Right.
So that might have had something to do with it. It might have been political in nature. However, it also could mean that they wanted their chief back here.
Right.
So there's a lot of reasons for that. And I'm glad they did. Because what that shows you then is that it's a recognition that even though he was living and buried in East Prairie, he was still the chief of Sucker Creek. So that residency clause that they have is actually out the window.
Moving past 1936 and coming into the war. Your father was a soldier, and Fred Badger's father was a soldier.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about what you know about Fred Badger's.
You know, I don't know very much about Fred Badger. And the reason I don't is that war wasn't glorified by the veterans. It wasn't talked about by the veterans. And the questions, a lot of times when you ask questions of the veterans, those who saw active duty, such as Fred Badger, such as my dad. My dad went in there from 1939 and came out when the war was over. He was on the front line right through. And yeah, he could probably tell you stories, but he didn't. And he wouldn't talk about things that happened and the horrors that he's seen, or even the good times that he's had, because through all those years there may have been some good times and may not, but ultimately, no, there was very little that he would say about. And anybody that saw active combat doesn't tell stories. They don't.
What do you think those veterans felt? They've just signed a treaty. Now, all of a sudden, this big territory that they're part of has now been reduced to 39 nations. And this region in particular, 5. And everybody's been kind of separated. How do you think that they felt going into the war, looking at the way the federal government treated them? Because there are those who signed up willingly, and then, like your father, there are those who were signed up by their parents.
Right.
How do you think that affected them? I think your firsthand experience with generational PTSD would be very valuable for most people to learn.
Well, I know, like it's not. It would be really, really difficult for them, and it was. I mean, it was difficult for the for my dad. I know that.
So let's talk about your dad's soldier story. He was actually a veteran. I've been doing largely research on killed in action soldiers. And he was a veteran that came home.
Mm-hmm.
But he was also a veteran who went to war very unwillingly.
That's true. See, he didn't. What it was that he didn't believe in fighting somebody else's war. And there were times that he did mention that. And he never mentioned anything about what happened in the war, but he didn't believe he should fight somebody else's war. He didn't believe that the Germans were going to cross the ocean and come and attack us in Canada. But had it happened, he would have been one of the first to be there. Much like his grandfather, Sam Cunningham, much like his great-great-grandfather, Patrick Cunningham, who was the first war that he was in 1713 with the Battle of the heck was the name in Winnipeg. So all throughout, and Sam Cunningham was also in the militia, St. Albert Rifles, but he would have been one of the first, but would have been to protect his family, because he had strong family values. It would have been to protect his, and by protecting his family, he would have ended up protecting his community. And from his community, he would have protected the families. So that's how that would have worked. And that's what he believed. He didn't believe to go out there, but once he went out there, like anything, yes, like anything, he did tell my son that once. My son told me, he said, you know, I took it on as a job. It was a job that I had to do, but I had to make sure I did it right. Otherwise, I wouldn't be coming back. You don't get fired from that. Yeah. He told him, and that was on a way going to Peavine for a memorial, Remembrance Day. And he was in a lot of things, and that's what he instilled in us, is that if you're going to do something, do it right. So yes, he didn't go willingly, but his father. See, I think I think I don't know what it was, but I only try to speculate because he never did mention it, and my mom never mentioned it either. But she would say the odd thing now and again. But and my mom understood well that she didn't know what it was, but she understood well because in, if she was angry or something like that, it's just coming out. She knew that. She didn't know what PTSD is, but she felt the effects of that lots, and she knew that it was something he couldn't control with his anger issues. But it wasn't really severe. I mean, no more than anybody else. But he was 22 years old. His mother passed away when he was 9. Okay? And then his father remarried a couple of years later, or a year later. And his mother-in-law was 6 years older than him. She would have been 15 when they got married. I'm thinking that it was my grandfather, maybe figured that maybe he should go.
Yeah.
You know.
So when we look at history, you hear a lot about how the government didn't court Indigenous soldiers. They didn't recruit them necessarily. And yet your father's story proves that to be false.
Well, but that's the thing, though. Okay. In the Jay Treaty of 1796, I believe it is. I'm not sure the exact year, but anyway, that treaty was signed with the states, and the reason it was signed with the states is that uh, there was traffic that was going on, like with the buffalo hunters and so on. So, and then the Métis hunters as well. So what they did is that they were going to go to war. Then the Americans left that war without a shell being fired. Okay, so at that time they wanted to have like uh, trade between the Métis and the Indian hunters and so on. So but they didn't have a treaty signed, and the Americans were saying that no, that's not fair to have all these people coming in with their carts of hides, buffalo hides. So they were going to go to war, but then they entered into this treaty, which, and the reason they entered into that treaty, like I was going to say earlier, is that the Americans heard that the Canadian side, they had over 5,000 warriors that were going to into battle. So knowing the
odds.
the odds against them, they called a truce. They entered into that treaty. But also, so in that treaty, they were allowed 1,000 pounds of goods, furs that they could put on their Red River carts. Also, they included that the First Nation, the Indians, would not enter into any wars for either country. So they were exempt from going to war. That's why they didn't actively go to the reserves. But once they were signed on, then they signed this declaration saying that I am no longer an Indian.
Right.
So that was one of the things that happened to some, is that they lost their status as soon as they left the country.
Right. The other thing that I found in research where they lost status was if they would better themselves.
Yes.
So if they went away to the military, um, and another little thing, I'm going to back up a step or two. Another little thing that I've learned is that First World War veterans would tell prospective Second World soldiers, change your last name. Don't let the Indian agent know you're leaving. Make sure your family has stories so that you're away chopping wood or you're away doing this, so that there's a reason for you to be off reserve that isn't military related, so that they don't go through the payroll to find out and then disenfranchise you. And I found some proof of those things happening throughout the different interviews I've been able to accomplish. So knowing that, how do you think your father ended up being literally recruited? And then the other question was, because of the other boys in the family having wives and children and being farmers and helping to sustain the machine, he was the youngest and therefore not married, so he was basically fed to the lamb or the wolf whether he wanted to go or not.
Basically, yes. See, because with him, and they were logging at that time. All his brothers were in the logging business, but for some reason or other, and they recruited him because, according to the Indian agent, he was not treaty. He was not registered as a treaty Indian. So therefore, he could be recruited, and that's what happened. Actually all the, like Callahasen, same thing. He was recruited as well. Dolphus Callahasen, I think it was Dolphus. I forget which one. But anyway, he went in about a year after. Tompkins come in a year after. A lot of and then there was some. I mean, they were some only spent didn't go to active war. They weren't in the front lines. Some worked in the mess hall, and they were veterans. But still,
they signed their name. They were required, they would go, and that makes them a veteran.
That's what makes them a veteran. Yes, I agree. And so those, to me, it wasn't fair in that sense, because that was the first step of taking away your identity. And that is that wahutuin that I was talking about, the family connection. And that was, when I say that, it was taken away by the residential schools. It was taken away by Indian Affairs. And after the Transfer Agreement Act, it was further eroded by the provincial government.
So then we're looking into the late 40s and into the 50s. And then all of a sudden, not only are residential schools very prolific in the region, but then you have the 60s swoop.
Yep.
and you have all of these children being scooped up and taken away and put in these schools, whether the parents wanted them there or not. And that further eroded that family connection.
Mm-hmm.
Like in the case of the Sawridge Nation, I mean, the Second World War just about completely decimated that
True,
nation.
true. It did, because all their members were taken in one fashion or another. You know, but what they ended up doing, and this again is the teachings of the residential schools, much like we see now. You see, one of the things that I found out, I shouldn't say I found out, I mean, it's been written before, and when I worked within the court system, of we had to, there was a psychology 101, I believe it was, but we had to take a course, and in that course, what, I don't know if I pronounced the word properly, but anyway, if you are sentenced to jail, okay, and you go to jail, and if you stay in there for a very minimum 6 years, not sentenced to 6 years, but if you stay in there for 6 years, you become institutionalized. So if you're institutionalized, then you start developing patterns that are being imposed upon you by the institution itself. You're teaching, you're learning that structure. So when I look at the missions, and no, and I don't know, I've never been on a mission, but when I look at the results of the mission, or the causes of the mission, and the federal government as well, the Indian Act. So when you look at the mission itself, first and foremost, what they do, segregation. They have that in jails. They put them in segregation to keep them away from population.
Right.
Okay. Here in school, at the mission, big boys one side, little boys one side, big girls, little girls. You cannot maintain that family contact because your brother's over there and your sister's over here, and your younger brother and younger sisters we're all separated. So this is that separation that the Indian Affairs and the Indian Affairs wanted this. They wanted this separation because we need to weaken the strength of the people. They used the church to implement this. The church became that. So now I'm not saying that they're all 100% horror stories. Excuse me. There may not be, but I would think there are. But the thing is that when you take somebody away for that length of time, and then you impose on them some doctrine that is going totally against their principles, and then you've done that, and then by the time you hit 1930, now some have already been in care for 9, 10 years, and then the ones that are born there and they stay until 1950s. So now they've been in there 6, 7 years. So, and you, as an individual, as a person, you have to follow along with what they're teaching you. Otherwise, you get the punishment. And what kid wants to get punished? So all that punishment is put on these kids, but then meanwhile they're taught all this separate. That's why today, that's why we have off reserve, on reserve. Oh, well, you guys are off reserve. You guys are on reserve. That's why we have that. And that's why they implemented it in their custom election regulations, where you had 90 people from the band here voted on that. And yes, we're going to develop it. It also says in there, when they did that, with the notes from Indian Affairs, they said that you have to ensure that your residency clauses are included in there. They didn't have to put them in there, but they had. If they chose not to, they could have left it out of there, because this was the custom election regulation codes that was band-owned. They could have taken them right out if they wanted to, but they didn't want that fight with the federal government because of the funding that was coming. Right. It's all about funding.
Yeah, and it seems like a lot to do with the indigenous culture, thanks to the European settlers, and not so much the settler themselves as the government that came with them, right? It's the Queen,
Yeah.
and British rule, and there's no dancing around that.
Mm-hmm.
Queen Victoria in her day, and the mother before her, um, when they when they decided that they were going to conquer the world and make one of the greatest dynasties that have ever happened, they chose to destroy so many things. The whole divide and conquer thing. It's like they are the best child molester, sexual abuser in the world, and they understand one thing: divide and conquer.
Yep.
If they can divide you and prevent you from talking to each other, they can instill fear. And the minute they have fear, they can govern you.
Yep.
And
Exactly.
that's exactly the way it seems to be.
Why do you think they didn't allow their wives to speak to other people? They didn't allow them to vote until 1917. You know, women now can vote, but it took that length of time for them to come in and the women to start saying that no, we matter, we care.
Exactly. And I think also from what I'm learning that the only person that benefits from colonialism is the dude at the top.
Exactly.
Everybody else gets the short stick.
Yep.
It's just that some short sticks are longer than others.
That's right.
And so the hard thing being a white person learning about this history
Mm-hmm.
is how did we not know this in our schools? How is this not being taught to us? How are like for myself, I'm
Mm-hmm.
a military brat.
Yeah.
If I didn't learn this stuff, then what did the rest of the world learn? Probably even less than we did.
Yes, and the reason for that though is that if they teach you the truth, you would have revolt. You would people in their right mind would say, "No, that's not fair." You don't like the thing is that you can take kids. Probably, I'm not sure at what age level, but you can take them and you can group them all together and go out there and play, and they play, and they get along. And you ask them, well, they don't look at their color. They just go out and interact. And that's the way it was within our community. Our community, I live in Joussard. I've always lived there all my life. Other than moving here and there, but I still live in Joussard. We have the reserves on either side. When I was going to school, that was the same thing. I'd go to I'd go in the mornings or wherever. I'd go to the store, and the storekeeper and one of the clerks that worked there. Some people would come in, and they would ask in French, "Who is he?" "Oh, les petits sauvages, Cunningham. Les petits sauvages, Cunningham." And I wasn't very old, and all I could and before I went to school, all I spoke was Cree. That was my language. That's what I spoke. After 2 weeks, I got a strap twice because I spoke Cree. I didn't go to the mission school. I didn't go to residential school. A couple of my older sisters did, but I didn't. This was a regular school. So guess what? I quit learning Cree. But I gained it back. I'm fluent in Cree right now because I had to learn it back. But the thing is that on one hand, okay, I was told by the adults, les petits sauvages. So then I was the Indian to the white people. On the other hand, my other cousins, who were treaty, hey, he's a half breed. He's a half breed. So they pushed me from one side to the other, both of them back and forth, until finally I said, enough is enough. I am who I am. So having that kind of a background, and when you mentioned how did that impact? Well, it did impact everybody. It impacted everybody quite a bit because now your administration dollars are coming to one place, and the administration dollars are what keeps the administration of each of the bands. But before that, they used to have this gathering, and that's the one good thing I saw about St. Bruno Mission was that they used to have this gathering in July. At the end of July, or they used to have this gathering they call Lake St. Anne because the St. Anne was a patron saint of the church. But anyway, they had this gathering, and that's where all the Aboriginal people would gather down at the bottom of the mission, and they'd have their tents, and they come in with horses and vehicles, and they have their tents and everything set up all around there, and they'd gather for 3 or 4 days, sometimes a weekend, and they'd visit each other and so on and so forth. But part of that was with going to the church at the same time, you know. So that part, the gathering, is what I remember, and this is what I found was, and it was beneficial in a sense that you met all your relations because not everybody could travel, so or visit. I knew I was fortunate. As growing up, the chief of Sucker Creek here was my dad's brother-in-law.
One final question. Why is it that in spite of the atrocities that the Anglican, Presbyterian, and Catholic churches inflicted on families,
Hmm.
so many honor religious traditions that aren't their traditions?
I suppose the basic. That's my opinion, of course. You're a young girl or a young boy. You're in a mission, and you're praying for better things. So you're praying to the Creator that you're introduced to, and you're getting strength from that Creator, telling that Creator and saying that, or the God or Jesus or whoever, and you're saying that, help me because I need this, help my sister, help my brother. These are the things that I'm praying to because that's something that's tangible. You can see that as you walk into the church, you see all these statues and these pictures. You walk into any schoolroom and you see these pictures of all the saints, or even of the Virgin Mary, whoever. You see these pictures. So that is who you draw your strength from, because all people, doesn't matter who you are, all people have to believe in something.
When I think of the Indigenous person as spiritual, I think back to the man I was introduced to when I was 6 years old. His name was Jean Villette, and he was my grandfather's best friend.
Mm-hmm.
And he was an Indigenous man who, um, very quiet, very, very composed gentleman, but he taught us some things that I haven't heard in a lot of other places. One of those things that he taught us was that when he would go out hunting, before he ever shot the deer,
Mm-hmm.
or the moose, or the elk, or the bear, he thanked that creature for being willing to give up his life for his family.
Mm-hmm.
He thanked the Creator for putting that animal in his
Mm-hmm.
place.
Yes.
And then he honored that animal and the Creator by using everything that could be used on that animal.
Yes.
You don't hear of that anymore.
Because I believe that strongly believe that. Not only do we take as much as we can from there that's usable, the front hooves, the front of a cow, we take that to make scrapers. The two bones that come out of there, we used to use them for the teepees, interlock like that for your sticks that go up. Those were used to be used. The little hooves in the bottom, that was for your jingles. They used to be used for that. Horns, whatever you made implements from. But yes, you always thanked the Creator. But some of us, me for myself, that's how I was taught by my brother-in-law. But anyway, I used to hunt with him a lot. He's 10 years older than me. But anyway, when we go hunting, yes, we say thank you to the Creator. Well, in a separate setting, we thank the Creator for the animals that sustain our lives. We've got that. And then there's, well, once we do shoot an animal, we give an offering to the elders that had left before us, to the spirits that brought this animal placed in front of us. And how we do that is we take part of the heart and we hang it, put it on a willow or something and hang it up and make that offering. And then at night, we'll make an offering of tobacco to the spirits as well.
Now that we're talking about tobacco and the importance of tobacco, when you're laying down tobacco to either thank or ask
Mm-hmm.
for something, what is the significance? Where did tobacco itself earn the significance in Indigenous culture?
I don't know. I was told that the reason that you use the tobacco is because when it's much like lighting a smudge, but the tobacco itself is what the ancestors, our elders, always did enjoy that tobacco, because tobacco come from down east, and that's they used to use it in their ceremonies and so on and so forth. But the tobacco and the essence of tobacco itself, it rises up, and we all know that the spirits are around us, and that's the reason for it, because your tobacco smoke is always going up, not sideways, not down, it's always going up. And you can watch it, how it travels when you're going your tobacco. You can watch it, sometimes it'll go up like that, spiral, different ways. And that's the difference. I was told anyway, and some of it, I don't know, I just believe it, is that it's how it twists is going to different spirits. Sometimes straight up, who knows? Maybe it's going to the eagle because the eagle is the highest.
Right.
And it could be wiggling, and because it wants to affect the spirits around it.
The spirit of the treaty was that as long as the sun shines and the grass grows and the river runs, the Cree people are going to have this land for time immemorial to live on, and the government is going to support them with education and food supports in time of need and any other medicines
Yep.
and things like that. Yet that's not exactly how things went.
No, it isn't. See, the thing is, and that's the thing that a lot of people don't understand. We can sign the treaty, but in any document, if there's the intent that you sign, okay, you believe it's in its purest form, so it's basic, completely basic. But the contract that they make out, then there's little things in there that whereases and why and so on, and those take away the intent. So yes, we did lose a lot. The intent of the treaty is not there. Or I shouldn't say that. The understanding that we had from the signing of the treaty is not there. We have been left with a watered down version of what we expected. But the government, in its infinite wisdom, looks at the treaty and says, okay, you got the right to hunt. It doesn't tell you what you can hunt. It doesn't tell you.
Where you can.
That's exactly it. It doesn't tell you. Well, no, you can't hunt in Treaty 6 because you signed a Treaty 8. But you can't hunt in part of BC. Well, that's wrong because that's where our treaty goes, But this is what they're trying to impose on you. And they'll keep doing that because why they are doing this is that they want to maintain control of the resources that are in the area. In any resources, this country is resource driven, and that's what they want to. They want to control that, and for us to be able to, we have to slow it down to a point where, if we're going to have access to the resources, we first need to understand how we're going to disperse it. You know, we don't need to look at somebody else and say, oh yeah, the Joneses over there next door, look at what they got through their treaty. Well, just wait till I get elected, I want to be the same as them. No, it's not how it works. It should never be like that.
No.
Our first priority should always be to maintain and elevate as a group, our living standards of living,
And your family
and the family connections. But we need to understand Our family is not only the people that live in our house.
No, it's the extended.
It's our family. It's Ndutimak, Niwahumaganak, all of that.
If you had the opportunity to share with someone who is non-Indigenous,
Mm-hmm.
one thing about your culture, something that's most sacred to your heart, what would that thing be? What would you want them to know?
For me, specific, what I would want them to know is that we don't segregate, we're inclusive. So when you as a person come to me and discuss anything, or I as a person come to you, we're equal. We are equal, will always be equal. Yes, we have differences, but in order for us to maintain that equality, we need to understand what the differences are. Okay? Our differences, yes, it sets us apart as individuals. However, that shouldn't set us apart as people. So I don't know what else I could say. Uh, I've always felt that way. I've always felt that, you know, understand, first and foremost, understand who we are. Okay? You understand who we are. You understand that we're sharing this country with you. We are sharing it. As much as you share with us, we're sharing with you. You know, yes, I understand. We were here first. I understand that, and this was our land. Yes, we entered into treaties, but we also have that Aboriginal right to the land. The Aboriginal right, the inherent right that we have, is first and foremost. Treaty just identifies certain rights, but our inherent right is to the land and to each other. Once we can recognize that, we're not taking anything away from anybody. All we're trying to do is ensure that on the flip side, that nothing is taken away from us either, so that we can live collectively. Much like, you know, one other thing people should understand, we were placed on reserves. We had this whole area here, Lesser Slave Lake region, and finally then the government put us in each of our reserves. I was talking to one lady. I was working northern BC, and we were talking about this in the kitchen actually, and she was saying, she didn't really think it was fair that Aboriginal people can have, they got the reserve over here, but they got all this work on the outside around surrounding the reserve. He said, it should be open to anybody. That's not fair, she said. Like, don't get me wrong, she said, I'm not racist. She says, but I still don't believe that Aboriginal people should have preferential treatment for the land around their reserve. I understand the reserve, yes, but not around. And I said, okay. So I said, let's assume, well, I'm going to give you a context. I said, so who is the most populous peoples on the planet? Orientals, Chinese. I said, you're absolutely right. I said, so what would happen? What would you do? I said, what would we do? I said, if the Orientals came and took over our country, and they claimed all the country, and then they started imposing their laws on us. I'm not sure where you live, but if you live in Fort St. John, she said, yes, I do. So what if they come around and put a fence around Fort St. John? And I said, and then they had guards there. So if you had to leave, you had to sign a piece of paper and go out before you can come back in. You needed permits to go here. You needed permits to do this. If you had food or if you wanted to go hunting, you needed a permit to, and if you want to raise cows or cattle or anything, you needed permits and you needed their permission to tell you when to go, when to leave, what to eat. How would that feel? Oh, that would feel like a prison, she said. Welcome to the Indigenous peoples. That's what we had. we had that. Maybe not the guns in that, but yet we still had, we had to sign our paper to get off the reserve.
Good point.
I was working for a company out of Blueberry,
Mm-hmm.
and I had a meeting with CNRL, senior executive and senior, he's a vice president. So anyway, we started talking about like what kind of opportunities we can have. And he said, you know, CNRL is very, he said, we're very receptive to ideas from Aboriginal people. He said, what we do, he said, we will work with you, we will work with the Aboriginal people, and we will try to build them up so that they can be self-sustaining. And I said, I appreciate that very much. I'm really glad that you could do that. He said, like what we did in Saddle Lake. He said, we went over there, and he said, we started working with this company. First, we worked with a band, and then we worked with this company. We developed this company. It became they were really good for a pipeline company. They started off with, you know, a couple of pieces of equipment, because we gave them the contracts and we assisted them. We had a 5-year deal with them, and they bought equipment and so on. So they were really successful. I said, for 5 years? He said, yeah. I said, okay, so what happened between from year 6 to 10? Oh, well, we're not really sure because we pulled out of there. I said, well, why didn't you take them with you? Well, no, they were from Saddle Lake. I said, I'll tell you a little story. I said, you know, I said, our ancestors. I said, I'm of Irish descent. I said, but it's so watered down. It's, you know, I'm to be totally honest with you. I said, I'm about 96% Cree Indian, and the other 4%, there's 2% French and 2% Irish. I said, and I did my blood quantum only because my in-laws kept telling me I wasn't Cree, I wasn't an Indian. So I had to prove that I was. But anyways, those Irish ancestors, I said, they had a castle in England over there, but not every one of them lived in there. So anyway, they used to be, they were the workers in the fields, the Cunningham. Some, I said, and same thing with the English people. They'd be working in the fields and they'd be looking on top of this hill. And you can see this castle over there, and they all wondered, oh, it must be nice because they see these carriages going into the castles. Well, of course, good times, eh? And I said they had such a really nice lifestyle over there in them castles up on top of the hill. So then they thought, well, okay, we have to have a better life than this. We're being oppressed. So a lot of them immigrated, came into Canada, worked their way up, had got land, had children. Their children, they went to school, they started teaching them. And like I'm talking 200 years ago until now. And then these children, they started gaining expertise in certain fields. And then they started down over there, working their way up. And now, hey, those same people are now sitting up here. And we're looking down at the people over there and wondering how fortunate we are. We didn't come very far in 200 years, did we? Cunningham, you have the weirdest way of explaining things.